Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and our young friends over there. Ladies and gentlemen, too, by the way. So you're very welcome. Good to see all of you here. Absolute delight to welcome you for this session in which we'll be discussing two books. One is Revolutionaries on Trial by Aparna Vaidik, and the other book is A Samurai Dream of Azad Hind. It's a book on Rashbehari Bose by Prasun. And my role this morning is to be the Sutradhar. So I will be engaging in conversation with my fellow writers over here. And what we'll try and do, friends, is to essentially go beyond the well-known aspects of such revolutionaries like Rashbehari Bose, or in Aparna Vaidik's case, Bhagat, Singh, Sukhdev, and Rajguru, who were sort of triumvirate, if you will, of a particular phase of Indian revolution against the British. So I think what we'll try and do this morning is to peel away the layers, if you will, and look a little behind these people and their lives, and also ask our friends here, our colleagues here, about what they found interesting enough and to revisit these very well-known names in our history, and what new thing did they find, did they discover in their journey, and what led them to finally publish a book about very well-known people, or so we think. So I will sort of just jump right in, and at some point, I hope not too long in the future, I'll bring all of you in. So after our conversation is done, we've got the ball rolling. I will invite the audience to join in. My sincere request to you is, and I'll be brutal about this, we are, after all, talking about revolutionaries, so I'll be a little brutal myself. If you meander in your questions, I will be brutal with you. I'm telling you this straight away. Do not blame me later. If you come at me with the thing, I have a question and a remark, please go home, because there are other people waiting to hear what they have to say, right? If you have a comment to make it brief. Otherwise, I will interrupt at the cost of your life and limb, and possibly, this being Kolkata, my own as well. All right? So I'm just putting it out there. This is the ground rules of the house. So let's get to it, ladies and gentlemen. I'm very keen, Aparna, I, of course, admire you tremendously as a historian, and I'm privileged to call you a friend. And I was just to sort of reprise my introduction, what is it that drove you to revisit these three very well-known names? What were the new ways that you went around it? One, of course, is that you visited Pakistan. You went to Lahore, where the nub of the trial was taking place, and that is an aspect that is, of course, quite ignored in Indian writing about these people and about the trial, because nobody really gets to go to Lahore anymore. So you had an opportunity to visit the archives. So if you could take us through the sort of the formation of this book in your mind, and the interesting little discoveries that you had. If you could briefly introduce your journey to our audience, if I could invite you to do that.
Okay, so if I can wean you guys away from your mobile phones, I can see you all. So get off your phones and listen to me about the journey of the book. So, see, there is a presumption in Sudeep's question, and the presumption is that we choose our topics. We choose what we work on. Now, many people do that, but sometimes some themes and ideas and historical figures choose you as a historian for you to write about them. So I am the chosen one. And I'm saying this because this is the argument I had to give to the archivist in Lahore to let me look at the documents. Yeah, I had to sit there. He would make me wait every day. I had to do a satyagraha outside his office to let me have a look at the documents. So I had been tipped off by a publisher here in India that just for you to know, the trial that I write about, it took place in two phases. Yeah, the phase that all of us Indians and South Asians know about is the phase, which is the second phase under the tribunal. Yeah, but the trial went on for 2 years before that. So I was like, where are the records for that? Nobody's ever seen those records. So somebody had tipped me off that they're there in Lahore. I reached Lahore, and Then the director of the archive showed me an index. That was a strategic error on his part. He showed me the index, and I turned into the monkey who puts their hand inside a bottle to get the peanuts out, and then can't open their fist. Yeah? They need to let go of the peanut. I couldn't let go of the peanut. So I hung around with the bottle for several years. So, yeah. So that's how I got access to those records. But you asked me...
No, but I mean, what...
what led me to it?
No, not... What led you to sort of, the journey itself? Because clearly you found things of interest, which others haven't mentioned because they haven't access to the sources, they haven't had access to the conversations that you've had. And also, I noticed that you've also gone out on a limb, and I appreciate that very much, and I'm with you on this, about where you say that the whole trial itself of Bhagat Singh, Sukhdev, and Rajguru, in fact, that's a point you make very early on in the book.
Yeah.
If I can just preface this discussion with that point, is that Aparna posits, and in that she's in agreement with another historian as well, which you write about, that the British used the trial of Bhagat Singh, Sukhdev, and Rajguru to try and demonstrate to the world that they're actually fair, justiciable people. They used it, I mean, it was almost, it was not almost, but absolutely used that saying we believe in, yes, okay, not so much as a sort of a radical freedom of expression, if you will, but now that you've committed a crime or you've gone against the law, we are bringing the whole force of the British justice system or the British Indian justice system to the colonies so that you are delivered justice in the, in the Western liberal sense. But you posit that it was actually, in a way, a sham trial. In a way, could you talk about these aspects, please? Because these are, I think, very interesting, and I find these are the refreshingly new, if I may use that word, for something that's happened 100 years ago, nearly 100 years ago. To say it's still fresh, and I think these are the things that bring freshness to the book.
Yeah. Okay. So I'll just before I answer this directly, I want to give you some context. So what I'm looking at is the Lahore conspiracy case trial. Yeah? And in this trial, popularly known as Bhagat Singh's trial, but the trial was booked against Sukhdev. So it was actually Sukhdev versus the state. But the story, as the trial unfolded and the way the story got reported and later written about, it became Bhagat Singh's trial. Yeah? So just so you know that. And this was not the first conspiracy case trial. This was about the 10th or the 12th conspiracy case trials, and it was followed by others also. Now, this conspiracy trial is a particular term that was used in the British, like in the colonial legal parlance, to talk about trials specifically which dealt with the revolutionaries. And there was a presumption of conspiracy there. So if one were to ask, all of us know what conspiracy means, but how does, in law, what does conspiracy mean according to law? So conspiracy actually referred to a crime that may or may not have been committed. So conspiracy refers to an imagined crime. Yeah? So like you and I come together and say, let's go beat up that person. Coming from North India, this is like the obvious thing we always do. Any argument needs to be settled by going and beating up, right? So you and I talk about beating up someone, then one of us falls back and the other person goes, acts upon the intent. But when the conspiracy trial is filed, or we are charge sheeted, that even though I did not do the crime, but I talked about it. There was a covenant to commit the crime that in itself could get me booked by law, could get me charge sheeted. So that was the conspiracy crime. It was highly elastic in its definition. Yeah, it was an imagined crime. How much and who was involved and where they were involved, this was unspecified. Yeah, and therefore, in the case of the revolutionaries, time and again, when they were booked under as conspiracy trial, because one wasn't sure how many people were involved. Yeah, and this in turn is connected to the idea of sedition. So you see, sedition again is an unspecified crime in the sense, because how many people got impacted by that crime, how many people were involved was always unspecific. So you see, law tries to specify, you're going to be booked for this because you did this. But conspiracy and sedition actually harbor the unspecificity of law. The imagined part of law.
I'm sorry to interrupt. I can't help but interrupt over here and say that we could be talking about 2024. But that's another.
I didn't say that.
But we'll come back to it. We'll come back to it.
I didn't say that. Yeah, so just to tell you that this is a conspiracy trial and there's a presumption in rule of law, right? That everybody is fair and equal. But how does rule of law function when we are looking at an imaginary crime? Or a crime that may have been committed or was committed only by some people, but several people had initially agreed to commit it. So that's the unspecificity that the trial undertakes. Then Sudeep also used one word called sham trial or a faux trial. Or another popular term is show trial. Now this has been the historical sort of understanding about the trial that was a show trial by the state. And I actually argue against that. That wasn't a show trial. What it was a conspiracy trial. And not the first of its kind. It was preceded, like the first one was Alipur bomb conspiracy case trial. So, the conspiracy case trials were around for quite some time. But it was a show trial for the revolutionaries. That is that they were using the trial to enact the idea of revolution, to enact or to commit, to wage a war against the state. So yes, it's a show trial, but I'm sort of flipping it. The historical argumentation so far has related this to state, but I'm talking about this in relation to the revolutionaries, that how they are using, it's a propaganda. It's propaganda by, public propaganda through the trial.
And in fact, that was one of the fascinating parts that I encountered in Africa. And we'll just revisit that in a minute. And I just wanted to ask Prasun sort of to riff off of a similar question, but in a slightly different way, because here you're talking about a person almost in isolation, Rashbehari Bose. And by the way, this is not Rashbehari Bose, who lends name to Rashbehari Avenue, just in case that strikes you. That's Rashbehari Ghosh. So it's not the same Rashbehari, by the way. And that's a common fallacy. That's WhatsApp history, in case you're wondering. It's a different Rashbehari. But so to riff off that, Prasun, again, it's a very, and you haven't answered the question yet in the terms of, we'll just come back to it shortly, where I want you to share, Aparna, about the interesting aspects that you found, maybe with your journey to Lahore. And I would like you to share those stories as well with us. But just to step in to bring Prasun into the conversation, I'm very keen to know from you, and you are not a trained historian, but you've written what I call, I would imagine, or I'm sure you think of it as well, a passionate book about Rashbehari Bose, a samurai dream of Azad Hind, and I noted that your publisher has put it in all caps, the other Bose. There is a Bose beyond Netaji or Subhash Chandra Bose as well. But so this is it's a very definite take or positioning of a story. And again, why did you pick on Rashbehari Bose? It's not as if he's unknown specifically in Bengal. And Aparna's book is about another aspect of India's revolutionary history or Indian history. Rashbehari Bose you positioned it almost as this sort of Bengali giant revolutionary, not just, it's sort of as if the Bengali revolutionary is greater than the Indian revolutionary. One gets that tone in the book. So why pick on Rashbehari Bose in the 21st century? Why now? And why somebody as young as you would select Rashbehari Bose as your subject? Could you share briefly with us?
So, good morning, everyone, and thank you, Apeejay Kolkata Literary Meet, for welcoming me here. For your question, yes, I'm not a trained historian. I began my writing by writing for children. So, my first two books were for children. And there was a time when I was discussing with one of my mentors, the dean of the Maharaja's Sayaji Rao University of Barodara. So we were discussing, and the idea came that why don't you write on the unsung heroes from Bengal? There are so many. Now, the word or the phrase unsung hero has two parts, unsung and heroes. Unsung, Rashbehari Bose is a name whom we have forgotten completely, I would say. like Sudeep was saying, Rashbehari Avenue is not named after Rashbehari Bose. Many of us don't know about it. And why I call, or I selected Rashbehari Bose as a subject for the biography which I wrote is, you know, when I read about him, whatever minimal content was available, one thing came out, that this was one man whose journey defined of a firebrand revolutionary, and how that individual, you know, metamorphosed or transformed into a global leader who came forward to put the context of Indian independence in the global arena, taking India's freedom and placing it in Southeast Asia. You have reference in Shochindranath Sannal's Bondi Jibon also, where he has written to Shochindranath Sannal in 1922 that India's independence has to be the prime factor to drive in global peace. This is my message to the entire Southeast Asia and to the world. And using this context, we can get independence for India. So that was his message, why he created the Indian Independence League as long back as in 1924, and continued the mission of spreading the message of what India was suffering through. And he was hard-headed that India must get her independence, complete independence. He had to go away to Japan. There was no escape for him. But even when he was in Japan, he has been constantly striving to fight for India's independence. And that is how the Azad Hind Fauj came into life, I would say.
No, so just to add to that, I mean, I appreciate what you're saying, that now you're stating history, right?
Yes, yes.
But my question was a little different, because, I mean, these are, like you just laid these facts out.
Right.
These are historical facts. These are maybe, I'm not going to say truths, untruths, I just put them as historical facts, to use another phrase. They detail the functions and the thoughts of a person, right? But
Right.
why pick on Rashbehari Bose? Because you still haven't answered my question. My question was, why Rashbehari Bose now? He's not entirely unsung in the Bengal sense, or the Bengali sense. He's also well regarded because, as you heard Prasun say, that he ended up in Japan, where he was actually revered as an Indian revolutionary. And of course, there are very gray areas about an Indian being in Japan and then trying to sort of incite Japanese involvement to get the British out of India, and in that compromising with certain other values. We can get into a discussion about
And his
Eastern,
famous
Western,
restaurant, his curry restaurant.
his curry restaurant, which curry restaurant, and the curry, which outlives his other legacies. But the point I'm trying to make is that you have the trajectory of this man, Rashbehari Bose, who's an amazingly interesting man. But so I would like you to answer that question, please, because we have young friends in the audience, and I would like to bring them into this conversation as well. It's not just about the right side of the audience, but I want to address the left side as well. Many of these are known. Like, I remember reading about Rashbehari Bose as a youngster, and this was part of sort of household conversation. I mean, this is something that my parents talked to me about. Bengali revolutionaries and the revolutionaries detailed in Aparna's book, Bhagat, Singh, Sukhdev, and Rajguru. These are things that in Bengal was a thing that you grew up with. Binoy Badal Dinesh, Rashbehari Bose, Netaji Subhas. You know, these are like names that come to us very easily. So, at least in this part of the world, this part of India. So why did you pick on him? Because I'm asking this to you as you being a relatively young writer. Why did you pick on him to write about him? Why did you choose to write about Rashbehari Bose? I just want to sort of
it's an honest acceptance that the way he operated, the way he worked throughout his career, that is what inspired me to write about him. Like, when you choose somebody to write upon, there is something which draws you towards a character. So he had been doing various things at various points of his life, which had been totally, unique in their own ways. If you read the book, you'll get a hint of the things. I'm telling it to the audience over here. But there are certain things which he did, which were, he was thinking out of the box always when he is striving to fight for India's independence. So these are various factors. When I read about him, those things pushed me to write about his story.
So there is an aspect about Rashbehari Bose. Clearly, I mean, that's valid that he takes the idea of Indian independence to a part of the world that is not so familiar with it, and then introduces them to it, and he sort of plays geopolitical games in his own way to try and bring the Japanese empire, if you will, one of the significant Axis powers, into the project to get the British out of India. I take your point. So I'll come back to that. Now, I'm still not entirely happy with what you said, but that's my personal quibble. We'll come back to that. It's not about what I think about what you've said, but I just want to engage us in the conversation. But let me bring here back to Aparna, if I may. You know, just to take from what Prasun was saying in terms of he found this of interest. Now, again, can you take us through your personal, these little gems of discoveries that excited you about writing the book, and the process of research, the process of discovery about aspects of the lives and the lives of during the trial, the lives or the lives before the trial of Bhagat Singh, Sukhdev, and Rajguru?
Okay, so my research on this book started about 15 years back, and I was still teaching in US at that time. And being in US, you know, I was living in US in the post 9/11 era. So there was a lot of writing, sudden interest in violence and networks of terrorism and revolutionism in its own way amongst a certain set of scholars, especially Middle Eastern and South Asian scholars. So that's where my interest also began to, I began to look at the Ghadarites. These are Punjabi revolutionaries who were based in California. I started looking at their lives because I was there and I had access to records. And there was a very famous case that took place in 1915 in US dealing with the Ghadar revolutionaries, which impacted their immigration laws and their citizenship laws. So Indians were seen as white people until 1924 in America. It's only after that particular case that we come to be seen as brown and Asians and all of that. Anyway, so that was the story I was really looking at. And then as I made my way towards, the archives in England, and then, in England I found this one book and one obituary. Yeah. Now this one book and obituary actually belonged to this guy called James Scott. Now James Scott was the police officer in Lahore that these revolutionaries had set out to assassinate. So the day they went to assassinate him, he had gone out for a visit, for a field trip to some other city. And they ended up assassinating John Saunders instead. And James Scott lived on. Yeah? And he lived on, and he got so scared after some time that he took a steamer back to England. And after some point, once his service finished, never came back to India. Yeah? At some point, James Scott died, and one of his obituaries and a book that his son had gifted him, that made its way to the archive, the East India Company archive in British Library. So I found his obituary, and it had all these stories about him, about his life. And I found the book that he was reading when he died. And this was a book on Jallianwala Bagh. And that man had marked up the book. On the margins, they were like, yes, yes. And then when you like something, you put two lines there, you underline. So it was heavily underlined and all that. And in places, he had remarks for his son. And that was like a brilliant find, his thoughts were being poured out in their own way on the pages of that book. And that told me about the functioning of his mind. Because he was the man who led the lathi charge against Lala Lajpat Rai, against the Simon Commission protest. And here was the officer who was, in charge on that day, and I had the book that he was reading many years later in my hands with his remarks, the marginal layer, And that opened up something for me. And at that time, I was also looking at records of Bengal revolutionaries. But, all due respect, they're very interesting, but James Scott was more interesting on that day. Yeah?
I didn't say that.
Oh, yeah, that's... you prompted it. And then, when I came to India, I began to look at the records in National Archive. And there, initially, I started looking at materials of Gandhi murder trial, because they were very interesting. And then I moved to looking at different sets of papers. And then there was this set of records, private papers, which belonged to Sukhdev's brother. So Sukhdev's brother, just so you know the character in the story. So the book is a bit like War and Peace. There are too many characters. So one of the characters is Sukhdev's brother, Mathura Das. Mathura Das Thapar. So surname was Thapar. We don't use it generally. So Mathura Das's private papers are in National Archives. And as I was looking through it, I found a letter exchange between him and one of the other associates of Bhagat Singh. And this is an associate who had testified against his fellow revolutionaries in the trial. So finding those letters, and Mathura Das is writing to him asking, why did you do that? And that letter exchange is full of pathos. And I was like, after that, there was no going back. I was sucked in. I was like, I'll have to work on this. So that's why I said, we think we choose topics, right? But often it happens. History is a lot about serendipity, chance discoveries, yeah? These ruptures, these disruptions of your own life. And my life got disrupted when I saw that letter. The HSRA chose me to write about that. I was like, there is no going back. This is what I'm working on. And then I found another document in the archive. So while I was looking through Mathura Das's correspondence, I was also looking at the court trial proceedings. So I told you the tribunal part of the trial, the second part of the trial, that those proceedings have been printed. Yeah, printed and made available in different archives across the world. Now, the copy that was there in the National Archives, I was looking at it, and it had all these corrections in it. Now, often when you're restoring these documents, the restorer or the editor puts some ink marks over there to let you know that this is a restoration, right? So I'd seen that. And as I'm looking at Mathura Das's private papers, I chance upon one note written by Mathura Das saying how he was in possession of Sukhdev's copy of the trial. So when these people were sentenced to death, they were all given a copy, a printed copy, to make notes so that they could appeal. Right? The copy that Mathura Das had, Sukhdev had made notes in green ink. That's a copy I had seen, and I had mistaken those notes as the restorer's notes. I saw that. I stopped in my tracks again. I scurried back to that rack, pulled that thing out, opened it again, and I was like, gosh, this is the revolutionary talking to me, and I missed it. Yeah? So, so there was this chance discovery of different sets of documents which almost sort of blocked my path out. I could only go forward, and from there it just became a thing. Yeah, it became a journey, it became a hunt, it became a quest. Yeah, and which went on for 15 years. And at some point I had to reach out to a friend who went to a shaman to help me finish the book.
On that note, can I bring you back to the show trial aspect?
Yeah.
Because it's also fascinating that, and it is something because we face these in our present day situations as well, and it's amazing that something from the past is sort of harking to us in a way, where people take the opportunity of a particular trial to forward their case or to make their cause known, to get their thoughts known. So how did you see this amplified in the trial that we're addressing in your book?
Okay. So you see, there is a common assumption about these HSRA revolutionaries. And for the young ones, these are revolutionaries in the 1920s in India. I would like your attention a little, na? Look at me. Screen is nicer, I know, but this is nicer. So, yeah, so these revolutionaries are there in the 1920s. What was your question again? I got so busy.
No, it's admonishing them. This is such a professorial thing to do. We'll forgive you this morning. I was asking you that, could you tell us a little...
Show trial thing,
yeah,
no?
just
Okay.
how did they use it when you call it a show trial? Why do you call it a show trial? A couple of interesting examples about what they were able to amplify.
Yeah. Okay, yeah. So, see, show trial, when I say that it's a show trial of the revolutionaries, what we are saying is they're using the trial for propaganda. Now, these young men are learning how to use the trial for propaganda. And they're drawing on strategies of previous revolutionaries. Now, there is an easy assumption made by these revolutionaries that they're drawing on the Bolsheviks. Yeah, Bolsheviks are like people like Lenin. Now, Lenin was not on trial ever. Actually, the people whom they're drawing on are revolutionaries who go back to 1880s Russia. And there were these set of revolutionaries known as Narodniks. Yeah, Narod means people, and revolutionaries who believed in going to the people. So there was a movement, entire movement in the 1880s in Russia, where there were these revolutionaries who were going to the rural areas and mobilizing the peasants there. Yeah, and some of them were tried. Yeah, some of them actually threw a bomb on the Tsar, tried to assassinate the Tsar. Yeah, so these are the trials that these Narodniks had used for propaganda. Now that was the template that these revolutionaries were drawing on in the 1920s and putting in motion. Now how are they doing it? Now for some simple thing like making a bomb. Yeah, now you can just Google it. The recipe is available on the internet. So I believe. I don't know. I've never Googled it. And please don't Google it. You're not allowed to Google it. So how do you have the bomb? How do you make the bomb? Now the reason you make the bomb is because you remember the mutiny, the 1857, revolt of 1857. The cartridges were greased because the gunpowder will get wet. So to keep the moisture out, you grease them and put the packet on them, right? So many times these revolutionaries found that the guns and all that they used, the gunpowder and all was not working properly, right? And the guns and pistols were very expensive. So an easy solution was, let's make a bomb. Now how do you make a bomb? They had to learn how to make the bomb by going to Russia. So many of Bengali revolutionaries went to Russia, learned the recipe. But you couldn't just write a recipe like a cookbook and just pass it on. It had to be orally transferred. Yeah? So in the trial, they will ask their co-revolutionary who's become government witness, how do you make a bomb? So that guy is telling you the recipe. Then they will ask the recipe even in more detail. And there are nearly 15, 20 journalists sitting in the audience. Yeah, in the visitors gallery. Tomorrow, next day, they will go and put it in the newspaper. So the recipe has gone out. Yeah? So things like that. What books were you reading? Which books radicalized you? They will give a list. Okay, what is there in the book? Can you tell us again? And all that information has gone out into the public. Yeah? So they are actually, the information that used to be underground is now circulating in the public domain. Yeah, and that's how the propaganda is happening. And all the ideas, okay, but did you take an oath? Did your party have a constitution? What did you have to be? So they know they're going to get wiped out. Yeah, there are very few revolutionaries who went scot-free. Some did, many didn't also. So and a revolutionary's life, an active revolutionary's life was not more than 2 or 3 years. If you were an ideologue, you would last longer. You know, like Aurobindo Ghosh lasted. Yeah, Sachinnath Sanyal also lasted because they were primarily ideologues. You know, after a point, they weren't active revolutionary. But if you were an active revolutionary, you will last for only 2 or 3 years. So they knew they're going to go. So all the information, underground information was being parlayed, was being given to the public through the trial, through the, you know, by asking cross-questioning. So that's how the propaganda was happening.
That's fascinating. And don't you guys get any ideas, all right? You have a far more efficient system of communication these days, but we'll talk about that later. I want to bring Prasun in here. There's one aspect of your book, Prasun, which is here, ladies and gentlemen, and Aparna's book is here, available in the fine bookstore down the stage. Prasun, I was just interested with one thing by your book that really stands out, and I'm not sure if I'm comfortable with it because as a writer, there are writerly techniques with which one can approach a particular book, and that's where I'm coming from. So I was just, I mean, you're open about it as well, because when you say that there was not enough information about certain aspects about, for instance, Subhash Bose's interaction with Rashbehari Bose, or the thought process of a revolutionary. You see, and there you quite transparently own up to your writing technique where you've sort of created conversations, or you've created thoughts, and you've created interactions. And yet this is pitched as a book of history. And I was curious because, for instance, as sort of I'm not an accomplished historian like Aparna, but I'm definitely a wannabe historian, in that sense.
More than that.
All right, thank you. See, you said it, I didn't. See, I'm going to hold her to that. Anyway, the thing is that where are you? I'm clearly not you. I might have taken either a completely historical, researched approach to this thing and stuck with nonfiction, and sort of made non-fiction colorful, which, as you just heard, you can do it in masterful ways, and write it as a work of fiction, like a work of historical fiction, which is also all right, where you can take available information in history about people, about situations, and then create a universe, which is done because people are writing about Neolithic times and Paleolithic times and whatever kind of thing today and trying to make it SARS or whatever. But why didn't you take that route? Why did you choose a route of projecting it as a work of history and then injecting absolutely fictionalized interactions into the book? Did you consider writing historical fiction? Because that would have been another way of writing about Rashbehari, Bose, the samurai. I mean,
Yeah.
you know,
No,
I have a headline for this. I have a name for that book. Samurai, the story of Rashbehari Bose, you know, a novel or something like that. You know, why
Yeah.
not that and why this?
Okay, so
Kind of
I didn't want to make it into a historical fiction because, yes, there are conversations in this book, and like I told you, I'm not a trained historian. I don't belong to the, study of history in my career. But when I'm writing a biography on a man I'm passionate about, yes, there was a time when we used to talk about people like Rashbehari Bose in our society, in our day-to-day conversations. But today, if you come and you talk about Rashbehari Bose, hardly people would recognize him. Hardly people would recognize what they did. They might know the name, but what were they? What was Bhagat's contributions? For example, I would say, very few people or the younger generations would adhere to. So one intention was to make it in a conversational style, like a narrative non-fiction, so that it becomes somewhat interesting.